Fred and Rose West were a serial killer couple in England who murdered at least 12 girls and young women between 1967 and 87 in Gloucestershire at 25 Cromwell Street. The real number is suspected to be at least 20. Their crimes were driven by perverse desires and sadism. Some victims were abducted at bus stops, others were lodgers in their home. Most were extensively tortured and then murdered in their own cellar, dismembered and buried in shallow graves around or under the house. In 1971, Rose killed Fred's 8-year-old stepdaughter Charmaine in a fit of rage, and Fred buried her in the garden. In 1987, they murdered and dismembered their daughter, Heather, because she planned to leave and had revealed ongoing abuse to classmates. She was buried in a garden hole dug by her own brother. The case surfaced after the West children told others that Heather, their sister, was buried under the patio, which led police to investigate. In 1994, police obtained a warrant, excavated the property, and arrested both parents. Fred asphyxiated himself in prison with an improvised rope. Rose is serving 10 life terms without parole, continuing to claim innocence. The Ripper crew included leader Robin Gacht, Edward Spritzer, and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokorolys. In Illinois, between 1981 and 82, they formed a satanic cult at Gacht's home where they performed daily rituals. But Gacht soon demanded human sacrifices to appease the devil. The group confessed to killing 17 people through beheading, dismemberment, disembowelment, or gouging hearts and lungs out, along with an unrelated drive-by fatal shooting done for amusement. Their modus operandi was to kidnap young women and take them to Gacht's attic. There, they amputated victims' breasts with a wire garrote before eating parts of them, believing it would give them stronger satanic powers. They also kept the remains as trophies in a box. Gacht read from the Satanic Bible during these rituals. Their final victim survived and identified Gacht and his van, leading to the arrest of the crew. Gacht maintained innocence and was never tried for murder, but received 120 years for lesser charges and is serving time with parole, possible in 2042. Spritzer's death sentence was commuted to life without parole. Andrew Kokorolys was executed by lethal injection in 1999. Thomas Kokorolys cooperated, received a reduced sentence through a plea deal, and was released in 2019. He later claimed innocence and as of 2024 lived in Peoria, Illinois. The Bloody Benders were a family who ran an inn in Labette County, Kansas from 1871 to 73. The household consisted of John and Elvira and their children, John Jr. and Kate, although some claimed the latter were spouses rather than siblings. The family claimed at least 11 victims, up to 20 plus are speculated. Kate Bender was promoted as a spiritualist who used fortune-telling to lure victims. Travelers were invited to sit at a table placed over a trapdoor. With the victim's back to a curtain, Kate would distract them, while John, or his son, struck them with a hammer. One of the women then slit the throat to ensure death. The body was then dropped through the trapdoor into the cellar, where the bodies were stripped, mutilated, and later buried on the property, often in the orchard. Some victims carried valuables, others were just taken for the thrill. Bullet holes found in the cabin suggested some victims resisted after the hammer blow. After a doctor with important connections disappeared, a search party of 50 exposed the family's crimes, but the Benders were already gone. Their fate remains uncertain. Stories range from lynching by vigilantes to relocating under new names. One story linked them to the later Kelly family, which claimed victims in the exact same style. The Dnepropetrovsk Maniacs were two Ukrainian teenagers, Viktor Sayenko and Igor Sapronyuk, who killed 21 people over 21 days in Dnepropetrovsk during June and July 2007. The case gained worldwide attention after they recorded their attacks, with one video leaking. They started with torturing stray dogs, then escalated to humans for fun. Their crimes were committed openly in public, with completely random victims, including children and elderly, bludgeoned to death with a hammer, often laughing after their deeds. Their first victim was Ekaterina Ilchenko, attacked on a street in broad daylight when they struck her head with a hammer, leaving her face unrecognizable. This triggered a killing spree. Roman Tatarovich was beaten to death while sleeping on a park bench just hours later. Some victims had their eyes gouged out while alive, and a pregnant woman had her unborn baby taken from her. One victim survived by hiding in the woods and provided sketches that aided the investigation. Eventually, Supruniuk tried to sell a stolen cell phone at the pawn shop and made a call to prove it worked, which led to their arrest. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Alexander Hansar, who filmed the crimes but did not take part in the attacks, got 9 years. The Barrel Killers were led by John Bunting and operated around Adelaide, Australia, between 1992 and 99. The core members were Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlasikis, with Mark Hayden assisting in disposing of bodies. They murdered 12 people in a case considered one of the worst in Australian history. The group functioned like a cult, with Bunting using charisma and intimidation to dominate others. Bunting targeted people he labeled as undesirables, claiming they were child predators, homosexuals, obese, or druggies, based on rumors or personal dislike. Many victims were friends, acquaintances, or family members of the group, some even living with them. Others were briefly befriended and drawn in as easy targets. The first known victim, Clinton Trezise, was bludgeoned with a shovel after being invited over socially. Others were beaten between the legs until death or strangled. Bunting was a psychopath who enjoyed controlling his victims, forcing them to call him God or Master. Most victims were initially tortured, often by crushing toes with pliers. Bunting recorded their screams on tape. Most bodies were then mutilated, often with legs and feet removed, and in one case, flesh was cooked and eaten by Bunting and Wagner. The group got away with it until police investigated the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden, which eventually led them to the remains of 8 victims stored in plastic barrels inside an abandoned bank vault in Snowtown. Bunting received 11 consecutive life sentences without parole. Wagner received 10 life sentences. Vlasikis 4 and Hayden got 25 years. However, Hayden was granted parole and released in 2024. The Hillside Stranglers were cousins Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi, who murdered 10 girls and young women aged 12 to 28 in Los Angeles between 1977 and 78. They posed as police officers to lure victims from nearby locales, or abducted them from middle-class neighborhoods, then took them to Buono's upholstery shop. There, the victims were assaulted, tortured, and strangled with ligatures. Their bodies were cleaned and dumped naked across the hillside of Los Angeles. But the partnership began to collapse when Bianchi started bragging about the murders and enjoying the attention, worrying Buono, who eventually threw him out. Acting alone, Bianchi took the lives of 2 more women but left DNA behind. Police discovered the bodies in the trunk of one victim's car, and information from Bianchi's employer led to his arrest and his connection to the Hillside Strangler case. Bianchi attempted an insanity defense, claiming that his other personality was responsible, but experts concluded he was faking. To avoid the death penalty, he confessed to 5 murders and testified against Buono, leading to his arrest. Bianchi received life imprisonment. Buono was sentenced to life without parole and died in prison from a heart attack. The Poquianchis Sisters were 4 siblings who operated a brothel network called Rancho El Angel in Mexico during the 1950s and 60s. Delfina, Carmen, Maria, and Luisa are believed to have murdered at least 91 people, with estimates reaching as high as 200. Their victims mainly included prostitutes and customers. The sisters lured or kidnapped women from poor areas with false promises of work as maids or waitresses, then forced them into prostitution. The women were imprisoned and chained, their operation protected by bribed police and even former army personnel. When the women became ill, resisted, or were no longer profitable, they were either starved or beaten to death. Customers carrying large amounts of cash also disappeared. All bodies were buried on their ranch. Carmen eventually died of cancer before the crimes were exposed, but the other three continued. Finally, in January 1964, a woman escaped and police raided the ranch, uncovering mass graves, decomposed bodies, and even bones of babies. The three sisters were arrested and sentenced to 40 years. Delfina served only 4 years before being accidentally killed by a bucket of cement dropped on her head by a prison worker trying to peek. Luisa died of liver cancer alone in her prison cell. Maria was released on parole in 1990, lived anonymously, and reportedly died of old age. Abboud al-Tabak and Khajawa al-Dala were an Iraqi serial killer couple active in Mosul in 1917. Estimates placed their victim count at over 100, making them among the most notorious criminals in Iraqi history. Their first known murder was an elderly visiting female neighbor whom they strangled, cooked, and ate. Finding the meat too fatty, Khajawa suggested they target children instead. Their method involved using their young son to lure other children from the streets under the pretense of playing. Once inside the house, the victims were hit with a rock, cooked, and eaten. The skulls were thrown in a backyard well. But the disappearances went unnoticed due to the ongoing famine and World War I. The couple even opened a small restaurant and sold some of the human meat as venison. But then, a butcher customer discovered a child's finger bone in his meat and alerted the police. During the property search, they found the well filled with 100 children's skulls. Khajawa confessed everything after their arrest. Both were sentenced to death and taken by donkey to a public square. Crowds hit and spat on them. One mother, who lost 3 children to them, even bit off one of Khajawa's toes. The couple was then hanged before the crowd. The Angel Makers of Nagyrév were a group of villagers in Hungary who poisoned at least 45 people between 1911 and 29. Estimates suggest 300 plus. The group consisted of 26 women and 2 men. It was encouraged by midwife Zuzana Fazekas, who supplied arsenic. At the time, young women were often forced into arranged marriages, and divorce was not permitted. During World War I, many men were sent to fight, and relationships formed between local women and foreign soldiers. But when their husbands returned, Fazekas persuaded women who wanted out to poison them. After killing their husbands, some women poisoned parents for inheritance, others killed lovers, and even their own children. The murders eventually came to light. When police arrived to arrest Fazekas, she took some of her own poison. The cases resulted in 6 death sentences, 3 carried out by hanging, 8 life sentences, and 2 short prison terms. The Lonely Hearts Killers were Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, an American serial killer couple active between 1947 and 49. They have committed at least 3 murders, but bragged it was 17. They targeted lonely, mainly older women who placed personal ads seeking companionship. Fernandez posed as a romantic suitor, while Beck presented herself as his sister to build trust and make victims feel safe. Once accepted into the women's homes, the couple would rob them and empty their bank accounts before killing them. In 1949, Janet Fay, a 66-year-old woman engaged to Fernandez, stayed at his Long Island apartment. After Beck found her in bed with Fernandez, she struck her with a hammer and Fernandez strangled her. When Fay disappeared and her family grew suspicious, the couple fled. They eventually stayed with Delphine Downing, a young widow in Michigan, and her 2-year-old daughter. When Downing became suspicious of them, Fernandez gave her sleeping pills and then shot her. Beck drowned the child after becoming enraged by her crying. The bodies were buried in the basement, but neighbors reported the disappearances, leading to their arrest in March 1949. Believing Michigan had no death penalty, Beck and Fernandez confessed freely, unaware they would be extradited to New York. Both were fried in the electric chair. The Ludwig Killers were Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan, a German-Italian duo responsible for 28 deaths in Italy and West Germany between 1977 and 84. The two met in high school and bonded over extremist beliefs, claiming they were cleansing society of those they viewed as deviant, like prostitutes, the homeless, gay men, drug users, and priests they considered sinful. At their crime scenes, they left leaflets signed Ludwig, marked with a Nazi Reichsadler and Hakenkreuz, with slogans such as "We are the last of the Nazis," and justifying each killing as divine punishment. Their first murder involved burning a drug addict alive inside his car. The murder of a homosexual waiter, stabbed 30 times, followed. Other victims were hacked with axes and bludgeoned with hammers, including 2 elderly priests. One priest was found with an awl in his skull and a crucifix attached. Later, they burned a homeless shelter, the Eros Cinema in Milan, and a disco in Munich, killing many more. Their final attack occurred in March 1984 at the Melamara Disco in Italy. Disguised in costume, they attempted to ignite the venue with gasoline, but fire-resistant carpets slowed the blaze, allowing security to stop it and capture them. They claimed innocence and said they were scapegoats. Each was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Furlan escaped prison but was recaptured, tried to hang himself but survived, and was released in 2010. He is apparently still alive. Abel was released in 2016 but had a serious fall at home and never recovered from that. He died in an Italian hospital in 2024. The Tamarin Gang was led by a mother and daughter, Ivanova and Olga Tamarin, who operated in a small Russian village in 1909. They were responsible for at least 40 murders. The true number is probably much higher. Their 41 accomplices traveled to nearby villages to lure victims, usually men, by claiming that 17-year-old Olga, known for her beauty, wished to marry. Victims were invited into their home, where the dining room contained a trapdoor that dropped them into the cellar. There, the victims were bound, tortured with various instruments, and found their end. Afterwards, they took their valuables and ate their cheeks. Suspicion grew after at least 13 mutilated bodies were found in a nearby forest, and villagers noticed men entering the Tamarin's house but never leaving. A policeman disguised as a beggar entered the home, smelled corpses, and fled. Ivanova threw an axe at him, but she missed. On May 6, 1909, authorities surrounded the house. Ivanova and Olga fired revolvers at them before being disarmed and arrested, but their fate is unclear. A search uncovered 27 additional corpses hidden in a barn. 30 gang members were captured and convicted, while 9 were never found. The Angels of Death were 4 Austrian nurses' aides, Maria Gruber, Irene Leidolf, Waltraud Wagner, and Stefania Meyer, who are believed to have killed over 200 elderly patients in a Vienna hospital between 1983 and 89. The first murder was committed by Wagner, using a morphine overdose. She later admitted she wanted to play God. She enjoyed the power of deciding who lived or died and recruited the others. The group then developed a method designed to avoid detection. One aide would hold the patient's head and pinch the nose while another poured water into the mouth, drowning the victim in bed. Because many elderly patients already had fluid in their lungs, it was an unprovable crime. They were exposed when a doctor overheard them boasting about a recent murder in a local tavern. All 4 were convicted in 1991. But by 2008, all 4 had been released due to good behavior. The Zebra Killers were a group of at least 4 black serial killers operating in San Francisco between October 1973 and April 1974. They murdered at least 15 people, most of them white, but the real number is suspected to be closer to 73 since 1970. They called themselves Death Angels and were believed to be part of a larger organization tied to black separatism that promoted the murder of whites and dissident blacks. The attacks began with the abduction of Richard and Kida Haig at gunpoint. Kida was later found decapitated beside railroad tracks, while Richard, badly beaten and slashed, lay nearby. Many more victims followed, often shot at close range while walking or sitting in their cars. Their modus operandi involved a neatly dressed gunman approaching victims, shooting them repeatedly at close range with a pistol, and fleeing on foot. In one notorious case, a victim was dismembered and his limbs were kept by the killers. Eventually, a warehouse worker, where the murderers were based, provided inside details that led to the arrests of Manuel Moore, Larry Green, Jesse Lee Cooks, and JCX Simon. All 4 were sentenced to life in prison. Simon, Moore, and Cooks all died in prison. Green remains incarcerated. The Gang of Amazons was a serial killer family from Stavropol, Russia, responsible for at least 30 murders over 6 years. The group was led by Inessa Tarverdiva and included her husband Roman Podkopaev, their daughters Victoria and Anastasia, and was supported by relatives with police connections. Their crimes began in 2007. They posed as a family on camping trips, using the travel as a pretext to move between regions while scouting targets and committing murders. Victims were chosen randomly. The family mainly broke into homes, shooting victims or finishing them with knives, then looting valuables and passports. Their crimes were marked by extreme brutality and cold-bloodedness. Government officials, police officers, including their wives and young children, were shot or stabbed dozens of times. They also ambushed 2 teenage girls in their home and gouged out their eyes before ending them. The family even did random drive-by shootings for fun. Their spree ended on September 8, 2013, after Podkopaev and Victoria shot a couple and attempted another robbery. They fled by scooter, but were stopped by police, leading to a shootout that killed Podkopaev and a patrol officer. Victoria was seriously wounded and survived. Inessa and Anastasia were arrested shortly after at a campsite guarding a large weapons cache, grenades and stolen property, which linked them to numerous murders. Additional relatives were also arrested for assisting with police intelligence. Inessa said she regretted not killing more police officers and treated the murders as routine. Inessa was sentenced to 2 consecutive 21-year terms, Victoria only received 16, and Anastasia 25 years in a corrective labor colony.